The glass hit the edge of the table when Ray Doucette set it down. Not dropped. Set. Deliberately. Like punctuation. And then Admiral Robert Kessler said my call sign out loud in a room full of people who had no idea what it meant, and the ones who did, they went very still. Ghost. One word. 14 years of silence. And Brett Calloway standing 3 feet to my left, color draining out of his face in a way I hadn't seen since the night I told him I was re-enlisting. Ray stood up from his wheelchair. Slowly, like it cost him something real. I want to tell you I felt vindicated, triumphant, like every movie ending you've ever seen. I didn't. I felt tired. Before I take you back to where this started, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your country and your local time in the comments. It genuinely means something to know who's out there. And if this kind of story stays with you, go ahead and subscribe so the next one finds you too. Now let me take you back to where this really began. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. That's the part nobody sees. The part before the part. I was sitting on the edge of my bed in the Marriott off I-64, still in the clothes I'd driven up in dark jeans, a gray pullover that had seen better years staring at the one dress I'd packed like it had personally offended me. Navy blue, a little wrinkled from the bag. Terry had told me to bring something nice. I'd brought the one thing that still fit the way it used to. I was 43 years old, and I was negotiating with a dress. My phone buzzed. Terry, you're coming, right? Tell me you're coming. I typed back. I'm getting ready. Which was true, technically. I was sitting very still in a hotel room in Norfolk, Virginia, which is a form of getting ready if you're generous about definitions. Here's the thing about military retirement parties, and people over 50 who've been around the service understand this without me explaining it. They're not really parties. They're reckonings. Everyone in that room is doing the math on their own life while they pretend to eat shrimp cocktail and laugh at old stories. Who stayed in? Who got out? Who made it to where they said they would? Who quietly didn't? I had been doing that math for 20 years. I knew exactly where I landed. I splashed water on my face, pulled my hair back the way I always did, low flat regulation habit that never quite left, and put on the blue dress. No jewelry except the small silver bracelet Terry gave me, the Christmas after Marcus died, the one she didn't know the full reason I wore it. I looked in the mirror for exactly as long as it took to confirm I was presentable. Not a second longer. I grabbed the box of pecan cookies from the bakery on Granby Street. I'd stopped there on the drive up because I needed something to do with my hands at a party, and bringing food is the kind of thing that gives you a purpose when you walk in a room. Something to hand off. Something to say. I brought these where should I put them? Instant reason to move away from the door. I'd learned that trick a long time ago. The drive to the Kessler house took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. I do that old habit, the kind that gets drilled in so deep it stops being a choice and just becomes the way your brain works. Time elapsed. Distance covered. Exit routes. Terry had said the Admiral's place was nice. That was an understatement the size of a carrier deck. It was a colonial on the water-white columns, American flags on both sides of the entrance, the kind of home that said, I gave my life to something, and it gave something back. There were maybe 60 people already inside when I pulled up. Cars lined the street for 2 blocks in either direction. I sat in the rental car for 4 minutes, not because I was afraid. I want to be clear about that. I have done things in my life that would curl your hair, and none of them were in a suburb of Norfolk at a retirement dinner. But there is a particular kind of dread that lives in ordinary rooms, in people who knew you before you became whatever you became, and it doesn't respond to training. It just sits there in your chest like a stone and waits. I knew Brett would be there. Terry had mentioned it 6 weeks ago, casual, the way she mentions things she knows I need time to process. Oh, and Brett Calloway might be there. He's got some connection through the Kessler family. I don't know the details. She'd said it and then immediately started talking about her kids' school schedules, which is her version of bracing for impact. I hadn't said anything. I'd made a note of it the way I made notes of everything, filed it, labeled it, put it somewhere I could access without it accessing me. That was the theory anyway. Brett Calloway. 46 now. Probably. We'd been together 4 years engaged for 8 months of those 4 years, and then we weren't. He was a corporate attorney in Houston. I'd heard through Cindy Marsh, our one mutual friend who still kept up with both of us in that exhausting way some people do, that he'd remarried, then separated, and was seeing someone new. His firm had done well. He'd done well. That was the version of the story I'd been given, and I had never gone looking for a different one. He had told me the night I told him I was extending my commission that I had peaked in high school, not shouted, not in a fight, just said it. Sitting across from me at a kitchen table in the house we'd been planning to buy together with my re-enlistment paperwork between us, like something that needed to be autopsied. He'd said it quietly, like a diagnosis. You peaked in high school, Danny. The Navy is just you running from real life. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I folded the paperwork, put it in my bag, and drove to the base. I signed the papers the next morning. I heard through Cindy about 14 months later that Brett had gotten engaged to a woman named Lauren. I was in Bahrain when I found out. It was 109 degrees, and I was eating a granola bar that tasted like cardboard and salt. I remember thinking good, and then I went back to work. That was 16 years ago. I got out of the car. I smoothed the blue dress. I picked up the pecan cookies. I told myself I wouldn't look for him in the room. I lied. The Kessler house smelled like brisket and old money and Frank Sinatra. That's not a metaphor. Someone had "Come Fly With Me" running through speakers I couldn't locate, and there was a long table near the back wall with what looked like a full Texas-style spread brisket, pulled pork cornbread coleslaw in a ceramic bowl the size of a small satellite dish. Admiral Kessler was from San Antonio originally. He'd never let anyone forget it. Even in retirement, apparently the man was going to feed you like you'd just come in from a cattle drive. I handed the pecan cookies to a young woman near the door who looked like she was helping coordinate things. She took them with both hands and a genuine smile and said, "Oh, these are from Granby Street, aren't they?" And I said yes, and she said the Admiral loves these, and just like that, I had accomplished the first social transaction of the evening without making eye contact with anyone over 30. Small victories. Terry found me in about 45 seconds flat. She has a radar for me in crowded rooms that I've never fully understood, some sister frequency tuned in whether I want it or not. She was wearing a red wrap dress and her hair was down, and she looked genuinely happy to see me in the way that also meant she'd been genuinely worried I wouldn't show. She hugged me too hard. I let her. "You came," she said into my shoulder. I said I was coming. "You said you were getting ready. That's not the same thing, and you know it." Her husband Dave was right behind her, big, easy-mannered, the kind of man who makes every room feel 3 degrees calmer just by being in it. He shook my hand and told me I looked great and meant it without making it weird, which is a talent I have always quietly appreciated in him. "Drink," he said. "Sweet tea if they have it." He disappeared toward the bar. Terry looped her arm through mine and started steering me slowly through the room, which is her way of giving me a tour without asking if I want one. The room was full of the particular mixture you get at a senior officer's retirement uniforms and civilian clothes in equal measure, people who carried themselves like they'd spent decades being responsible for things, and their families who'd spent those same decades holding everything else together. I recognized the posture more than the faces. The way certain people stood in a room, weight-distributed hands easy at their sides, eyes doing a quiet sweep every 30 seconds or so without realizing they were doing it. I nodded at two men I vaguely recognized from a joint exercise out of Oceania maybe 8 years back. They nodded back. Nobody needed to fill that space with words. That's something civilians sometimes find unsettling, the way military people can communicate entire paragraphs in a single nod and a held gaze. There's no coldness in it. It's just efficiency. You learn to say a lot with very little because very little is often all you have time for. Dave came back with the sweet tea. I held it with both hands and felt marginally more like a person. And that's when I saw Brett. He was standing near the fireplace on the far side of the room, laughing at something the man beside him had said, head tilted back, that specific laugh. I remembered, the one that was 30% genuine and 70% performance. He was in a blazer over an open-collar shirt, salt and pepper, now at the temples, in the way that tends to be described as distinguished when it happens to men who can afford good haircuts. He looked exactly like what he'd become. Successful, comfortable, settled into himself the way people get when they've decided the story they're telling about their life is the right one and stopped questioning it. The woman beside him was younger, mid-30s maybe, pretty in a careful, deliberate way, blowout heels, a dress that had taken some thought. She was watching the room with the particular alertness of someone who was new to this particular social orbit and trying to map it quickly. I recognized that look too, just from a different angle than she was working. Brett hadn't seen me yet. Terry felt me go still. She knows what still means with me. We don't have to go anywhere near him, she said quietly. I know. Dave can run interference if... Terry. I looked at her. I'm fine. She searched my face for a second the way she's been doing since we were kids, looking for the version of fine that means fine, and the version that means the complete opposite. I don't know which one she found. She nodded and loosened her grip on my arm just slightly. I took a sip of sweet tea. I watched the room. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Outside the tall windows, the last of the evening light was going gold across the water. It took Brett about 4 more minutes to see me. I knew the moment it happened because his laugh stopped. Not abruptly, it tapered the way a radio fades when you're driving out of range, and he turned his glass in his hand once, twice. Then he said something to the woman beside him and walked over. "Danny." He said it warm. He said it like we were old friends running into each other at a farmer's market. "Brett." He looked me up and down in that way he'd always had the assessment that was just slightly too obvious to be polite. "You look the same," he said, which was not quite a compliment and not quite not one. "So do you." "Still with the government." "Still with the government." He smiled. He shook his head a little the way you do when something confirms exactly what you expected. "Some things don't change, I guess." Then turning slightly to include the 2 men standing nearby, old friends of his, I gathered faces I didn't know he said it easily like weather. "Danny was always more comfortable in a uniform than a real life. I used to say she peaked in high school." He chuckled. "Turns out I was right." The 2 men made the sounds men make when they're not sure if they're supposed to laugh. Terry's hand found my elbow. I looked at Brett. I looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, not with hurt, just with the particular quality of attention I'd learned to give things that didn't require a response. I smiled. He smiled back. He thought he'd already won. The thing about being underestimated is that it has a texture. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates the way humidity does. You don't notice any single moment of it, but at some point you realize you're soaked through and have been for a while. People talk over you. People explain things to you that you understood before they started the sentence. People smile at you with a specific softness that isn't kindness, it's reduction. She's fine. She's harmless. She's not quite the thing we're really here to talk about. Older Americans understand this in a way that's hard to articulate to someone younger. You reach a certain point in life where you've collected enough of those moments that you can identify the species on sight. You know the smile. You know the tone. You know the way certain people hold their bodies when they've decided you're less than. Brett Calloway was fluent in that language. He always had been. He didn't leave after the fireplace. That would have been too easy. He drifted the way people do at parties, appearing at intervals, always within conversational range, always with that easy laugh and the blazer and the salt and pepper temples. He found me again near the food table where I was pretending to deliberate between the cornbread options while actually just needing 30 seconds of not being looked at. "You drive up from Virginia Beach?" he asked, like we were just continuing a conversation. "Yes." "Long drive for a party?" "Admiral Kessler served 32 years. It's not just a party." He tilted his head. Sure. A pause. "You knew him well." "Well enough." He waited for me to elaborate. I didn't. He picked up a piece of cornbread and ate it in 2 bites and said to the general air between us, "I always figured you'd have gotten out by now. Settled somewhere. Done something I don't know permanent." The word permanent landed with the weight he intended it to. "What I do is permanent," I said. He laughed. Not unkindly. That was almost worse, the laughing without cruelty, as if the idea simply didn't rise to the level of something worth being cruel about. "Government work," he said. "Right." Another beat. "No kids?" "No." "Anyone?" "No." He nodded slowly, the nod that meant I understand the shape of this. "Well?" He touched my arm briefly, a gesture that was meant to be gracious, and landed like condescension wearing a sport coat. "You seem good, Danny. You really do." I excused myself to find Terry. She was standing with Dave and a couple near the back windows, longtime Navy family. I gathered the wife had that particular ease of someone who'd moved 11 times and learned to make a home out of whatever 4 walls she was handed. I stood with them and let the conversation happen around me for a few minutes, which I'm good at. I can occupy a social space without filling it. I learned to disappear in plain sight a long time ago. There are worse skills. It was around then that I first noticed Ray Doucette. He was in the corner to the left of the fireplace in a wheelchair that he managed with the specific self-possession of a man who'd decided the wheelchair was a logistical fact and not a statement about him. 70s, maybe older, with a face like weathered ship timber, deep-lined, broad-jawed, the kind of face that had been outside in hard weather for a very long time. He had a glass of what looked like bourbon, and he was watching the room the way I watched the room, that same quiet professional sweep, nothing wasted, everything registered. He caught me looking and held my gaze for a second. Not aggressive. Assessing. Then he went back to his bourbon and the room. I didn't know who he was yet. I found out later from Terry that he was Master Chief Raymond Doucette, retired Navy SEAL, 30 years and 2 bad knees, and 1 worse hip from a jump gone sideways in the late 90s, friend of the Admiral's, going back to when they were both young men doing things that didn't have official names. She'd gotten that from Dave, who'd gotten it from someone near the bar who'd recognized the name. At the time, I just thought there's someone else here who knows how to wait. I was on my 2nd sweet tea when Brett found his way back to me a 3rd time. This one was different. He'd collected an audience not deliberately, or maybe deliberately in the way that looks like accident. 3 people from what seemed to be his professional orbit, 2 men and a woman all somewhere in their 40s, all wearing the comfortable clothes of people who didn't need to impress this particular room. He was mid-story when he reached me. Something about a case, a deposition, a very satisfying outcome. The story was good. He was a good storyteller. I'll give him that. He always knew how to hold a room. And then, as the story wound down, he glanced at me with that particular gleam people get when they've decided to be generous with someone they've already categorized. "Oh, this is Danny," he said to the group. "We go way back. High school, college, almost got married." He laughed. "She joined the Navy instead of making good life choices." The group laughed politely. The woman looked at me with faint curiosity. "What do you do now?" One of the men asked me, not unkindly. "Government work," I said. He nodded and turned back to Brett. Terry was watching from across the room. I saw her jaw tighten. She started to move toward me, and I gave her the smallest possible shake of my head. "Don't." She stopped. She hated that I could do that, communicate entire instructions in a 1/4 inch of movement, but she respected it. Brett said, wrapping it up with a smile meant to seem fond. "Danny never could commit to anything real. Even the Navy was just a long way of avoiding grown-up life." He shook his head, the fond shake, the what can you do shake. "Some people peak early, and they can't move past it. It's sad, honestly, but she seems happy." He looked at me when he said happy, waiting to see if it landed. I could have said something. I chose not to. I'd made that choice before, in rooms a great deal less comfortable than this one, in moments where the cost of speaking was measured in things heavier than embarrassment. I had learned the long, slow, expensive way that silence was not the same as defeat, that waiting was not the same as losing. In the corner, Ray Doucette turned his glass once in his hand and watched Brett Calloway the way you watch something you've already taken the full measure of. I didn't know that yet, but I would. Admiral Robert Kessler was not a tall man. That always surprised people who hadn't met him. You build a picture in your head, 32 years, 4 stars, the kind of career that gets written about in Naval War College case studies, and you expect someone who fills a doorframe. He was maybe 5'9" on a good day, compact with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of posture that had nothing to do with height and everything to do with the specific gravity of a man who'd spent 3 decades being the last word on things that mattered. He worked the room the way he'd always run an operation methodically. No wasted movement, genuine attention for every person he stopped to speak with. I'd watched him do it from across the room for 40 minutes. He had a gift for making people feel like they were the only person in the space, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most people know. I hadn't spoken to him yet. I was waiting for the right moment, or if I'm honest, waiting to see if a right moment would arrive, or if I'd spend the evening at a careful distance and leave with my pecan cookies having done their job and nothing more required of me. Terry had gone to find the bathroom. Dave was in a conversation near the bar that had taken on the absorbed quality of 2 men who'd discovered a shared opinion about something. I was standing near the tall windows with my 3rd sweet tea, watching the light go fully dark over the water, when I heard the gentle knock of a butter knife against crystal. The room settled. Admiral Kessler stood near the center glass raised, and he smiled the smile of a man who had earned the right to this exact moment and knew it without needing to perform it. He thanked his wife first. 31 years of marriage, 11 duty stations, 4 deployments she'd navigated alone with 2 kids and a calendar full of dates he'd missed. He said her name Carol, and the way he said it was its own complete sentence. He thanked his crew chiefs, his flag aides, the officers who'd served under him and were now commanding their own ships, their own squadrons, their own futures. He was funny briefly about a navigation incident in the South China Sea in 2003 that apparently everyone in the room except me knew about and found extremely funny. He was serious briefly about the cost, about the names that deserved to be said out loud even in a room that was supposed to be celebrating. He said 4 names, 3 men, 1 woman, a lieutenant commander who'd gone down with her aircraft off the coast of Okinawa in 2011. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when the weight of something real drops into them without warning. Then he looked up. He looked around the room with that slow, deliberate attention. "There is one more person I need to acknowledge tonight," he said. "One person in this room who most of you don't know by name. Some of you don't know at all." A pause. "And that's by design. It was always by design. That was the nature of what she did and who she chose to be about it." I felt something shift in my chest. Not alarm, recognition. The way your body knows something before your mind catches up. "I have been trying to say this properly for 14 years, he said. "I practiced it, threw it out, practiced it again." He smiled briefly at his own feet. "Turns out there's no good version of, 'I'm sorry it took this long.' You just have to say it and mean it, and hope it's not too late." The room was very still. "This officer flew combat missions out of 2 theaters. She qualified on the carrier at 26 one of 11 women in her class to do it. She led a tactical strike element through conditions that would have been unreasonable to ask of anyone, and she brought people home that nobody expected to bring home." He stopped. "And then she was asked to be quiet about it. And she was, because that's who she is." Brett had stopped moving somewhere to my left. I didn't look at him. "In this room tonight." Kessler said, "I want to give her what I should have given her a long time ago, which is her name, said out loud in front of witnesses attached to what she actually did." He looked across the room. He found me not searching directly like he'd known exactly where I was standing the whole time. "Ghost," he said. The call sign came out of him like something he'd been holding in his hands for years and was finally setting down. "Commander Danielle Hayes. Front and center." The room held its breath. Somewhere behind me, someone set a glass down on a table. Not dropped. Set. Deliberately. I turned. Ray Doucette was already looking at me. He was already moving not the glass himself, both hands on the wheelchair arms, pushing himself upright with the slow, effortful certainty of a man who had decided that whatever this cost his knees, it was going to happen. He stood, fully. At attention, not the stiff ceremonial attention of a parade ground, but the real kind, the kind that lives in the body after decades and never fully leaves. His right hand came up. The salute was crisp. Perfect. The salute of a man who had given it to very few people in his life and meant it every single time. I heard someone near the food table make a sound that wasn't quite a word, a soft intake, the kind of sound people make when they witness something they didn't know they needed to see. I looked at Brett. I didn't mean to. It was reflex, the old reflex, checking the face of the person who'd told you that you were nothing when the room started to tell a different story. He was pale. Not surprised pale, not confused pale. The kind of pale that comes when something you buried a long time ago starts moving underground and you can feel it in your feet. His mouth was open slightly. His glass was still in his hand. The bourbon hadn't moved. He looked at me the way a man looks when the floor he's been standing on for 16 years develops a crack directly beneath his feet, and he doesn't yet know how deep it goes. I turned back to Admiral Kessler. I crossed the room. I have stood at attention in front of admirals before, in hangars smelling of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid in formal spaces with marble floors and flags on every wall in the field in conditions that had no business being called formal by any standard. I know how to do it. My body knows how to do it the way it knows how to breathe without asking permission, without thinking about the mechanics. But walking across that room with 60 people watching, and Frank Sinatra finally mercifully having gone quiet on those invisible speakers, was one of the hardest 30 feet I have ever covered. Not because I was afraid, not because I didn't know how to hold myself, because I had spent 14 years making myself small in civilian rooms, and some part of me had started to believe that was the only size I was allowed to be in them. I stopped 2 feet from Admiral Kessler. I stood straight. He looked at me for a moment, just a moment, with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is in the specific process of putting it down. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief. Something that lives on the other side of it. "Commander Hayes," he said, quiet enough that the room had to lean in to hear him. "Thank you for coming tonight." "Admiral," he extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm and brief and said everything a grip like that is capable of saying. Then Ray Doucette spoke. He was still standing still at that full, effortful attention, both hands loose at his sides, now the wheelchair behind him like something he'd temporarily set aside. His voice was gravel and creek water. The voice of a man who'd spent decades shouting over wind and rotors and had settled in his 70s into something quieter and more permanent. "Ghost," he said. Not a question, not a greeting, a confirmation. The way you say the name of something you've been trying to locate for a long time and have finally found exactly where you left it. I looked at him. "Ray Doucette," he said. "Master Chief retired. I ran a SEAL team out of Coronado for 11 years. After that, I pushed paper at the Pentagon until they had the good sense to make me stop." The faintest curve of his mouth. "I read the after-action report on Bien Dong, the real one. Not the one they filed." The room shifted. A few people exchanged glances. Most of them had no context for what he'd just said. They didn't need it. They could hear the weight of it. "I know what you did out there," he said. "And I know what they asked you to carry afterward. And I want you to know that I know. That somebody knows." He paused. "That's all." It wasn't all. It was everything. I am not someone who cries easily. I was not going to cry in this room in this dress in front of Brett Calloway and 60 people I mostly didn't know. I had made that decision approximately 4 seconds earlier, and I held to it with both hands. But my throat did a thing. My throat did an involuntary thing, and I had to look briefly at a point just above Ray Doucette's left shoulder until it stopped. Admiral Kessler turned back to the room. He spoke for another few minutes about what the call sign meant in the broadest strokes he was cleared to describe about the nature of certain missions and the people asked to execute them. He didn't use classified language. He didn't need to. He painted the outline and let the shape of it speak. The room listened the way people listen when they understand they're hearing something true. I was aware of the room in pieces, Dave somewhere behind me who had gone very still. The Navy wife from the back windows pressing her fingers to her mouth. 2 officers near the hallway who had exchanged a look that traveled the full length of a conversation in under a second. Terry, whom I could feel more than see in the specific way you can feel your own family in a room. And Brett. I was aware of Brett the way you're aware of weather changing. The barometric shift of a man whose scaffolding is developing structural problems. He hadn't moved from his position near the fireplace. His brow was furrowed in the effortful way of someone doing rapid mental calculations about something they can't quite make the numbers work on. He said something quietly to the woman beside him, the girlfriend, the one in the careful dress who'd been mapping the room all evening. She didn't respond. She was watching me. Her expression wasn't the expression of a woman watching a stranger. It was something more complicated than that. Then Brett said it to the room, not quite loud enough to be an interruption, but not quite quiet enough to be private. The question of a man who needs to establish that he's not lost, that he's following along, that he is still a participant in what's happening and not a bystander. What does that mean? He said it to the people nearest him. What does that mean? What does ghost mean? What does any of this mean? Nobody answered him, not the two men he'd been laughing with earlier, not the woman beside him, not Dave, who was close enough to have heard and chose with the quiet wisdom I'd always respected in him to let the silence stand. Ray Doucette sat back down in his wheelchair. He lowered himself with the same deliberate care he'd risen with slowly, like it cost him something, like it was worth the cost. He picked up his bourbon. He took a sip. He did not look at Brett. That was the thing I realized. He didn't look at Brett at all. Not with contempt, not with satisfaction, not with any of the things you might expect from a man watching the architecture of someone else's smallness exposed in a public room. He simply didn't look at him. The way you don't look at something that has already been fully accounted for. Terry reached me. I felt her hand find my arm in the dark of the crowd, closing in gently, warmly, the way it does when a room decides it has witnessed something worth witnessing. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. People over 60 know this without being told. There are moments in life when words are just weather moving through. The real thing is underneath. It doesn't need language to be true. It just needs witnesses. We had them. People ask me sometimes, not often, but sometimes what it was like over there. I never know how to answer that in a way that's both honest and survivable for the person asking. So I usually say hot, loud, and a lot of waiting punctuated by moments you spend the rest of your life not quite being able to file correctly. That usually satisfies people. It's true enough. It just isn't the whole truth. The whole truth is harder to carry and harder to set down. That night, standing in Admiral Kessler's living room with the warmth of 60 people around me and the smell of brisket still hanging in the air and Terry's hand on my arm, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been locked. And when it loosened, the year 2009 came up through it like water through a crack in a hull. I was 31 years old. I'd been flying for 5 years out of carrier decks, the kind of flying that is nothing like what civilians imagine when they picture it. It is not freedom. It is not the open sky. It is a physics problem with a very narrow margin for error conducted at speeds that compress time into something unrecognizable in weather that doesn't care about your training in cockpits that are simultaneously the most sophisticated machines ever built and catastrophically small when things go wrong. I loved it. I loved it the way you love something that is also trying to kill you, which is a particular and not entirely healthy form of love, but there it is. The mission didn't have an official name. That's how you know a mission is real. The ones they actually care about don't get names until afterward, if ever, and sometimes not even then. It was a surveillance and strike element. 4 aircraft, 6 personnel total, including ground coordination. We were in the South China Sea coordinates. I am not going to give you an airspace that officially we were not in. My call sign was Ghost before that night. I'd had it since flight school, a joke from my instructor who said I flew like I wasn't really there, which he meant as a complaint about my radio discipline, and I chose to take as a compliment. It fit, so it stuck. Call signs are like that. They find you more than you find them. Marcus Webb was my wingman. He was 28, from Beaufort, South Carolina. He had a laugh that belonged on a front porch somewhere big and unhurried, the kind of laugh that made you feel like whatever you'd just said was the wittiest thing anyone had ever said in the history of human speech. He kept a photograph of his grandmother tucked into the left side of his flight suit just inside the zipper. Not regulation technically, but nobody said anything because nobody says anything about the things that help people get through. We'd flown together for 2 years. I knew his radio habits better than I knew my own. I knew the slight pause he always took before he keyed his mic, the way his voice went half a register lower when conditions got serious. I knew that he kept a running mental list of the best places he'd eaten in every port city we'd been through, and that the list was sorted by quality of the cornbread. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand who he was before I tell you what happened. He wasn't a casualty figure. He wasn't a line in a report. He was 28 years old, and he knew where to get the best cornbread in Bahrain, which is a harder piece of knowledge to come by than you might think. The mission went wrong in the way missions go wrong, not all at once, but in increments, each one small enough that you keep adjusting, keep adapting, keep flying the aircraft, and working the problem right up until the moment when the increments add up to something that can't be adjusted away. We took ground fire from a position that wasn't supposed to exist. The second element in our 4-ship lost systems and had to divert. I had Marcus on my wing and 2 personnel on the ground who needed extraction and a timeline that had just collapsed from 30 minutes to approximately none. The ground team was pinned. The extraction window was closing. The second element was gone. I had a choice. You can do the math on the choice. I've done it enough times in enough sleepless rooms since then that I could do it with my eyes closed. What I had: fuel state, ordnance position, enemy location, the sound of the ground team's comms going ragged. Marcus's voice in my ear saying my call sign, just once, steady as a hand on a shoulder. What the math said: if I made the run, I could suppress the fire long enough for the ground team to move. If I made the run, I was also making myself the most visible thing in that airspace for approximately 45 seconds, which is a very long time to be the most visible thing in contested airspace. I made the run. I brought it in low and fast, and I put ordnance exactly where it needed to go, and the ground team moved and got out. 4 people. They all made it. Marcus followed me in to cover my egress. He shouldn't have. I didn't ask him to. He did it because that's what wingmen do when they are 28 and brave and haven't yet learned that some decisions look like loyalty and cost everything. The ground fire that had been suppressed wasn't fully suppressed. 1 round. 1. Into his avionics bay, which doesn't sound catastrophic until it is, which it was at that altitude and that speed over that water. I heard him on the radio. His voice didn't change registers. It was even. It was calm. He said my call sign, and then he said, "I've got a problem." I said, "Talk to me." He said, "I think this one's not fixable, ghost." I said, "Eject, Marcus, eject right now." He said, "Yeah. Yeah." The way he said things unhurried, like he was still deciding where the cornbread ranked, and then the radio went to static. We searched for 4 hours. We didn't find him. I flew the debrief and I wrote the report, and I sat in a room with men who needed me to be composed, and I was composed, and afterward I went back to my bunk and I lay in the dark with the sound of the ship around me, and I thought about his grandmother's photograph, whether it was still in the flight suit, whether it was somewhere at the bottom of the South China Sea, and I thought someone has to be steady enough to carry this correctly. So I was. The investigation came 6 weeks later. Questions about the decision to make the run without full element support. Questions about whether my judgment had been impaired by, and here the language got, careful personal attachment to ground personnel, which was a way of saying I cared whether people died dressed up in language designed to make caring sound like a liability. I answered every question. I did not deflect. I did not perform. I told them what I'd done and why and what it had cost, and I let them write whatever they were going to write. They wrote what they wrote. I accepted it and I went back to work, and I did not speak of it again for 14 years, not in any room, not to anyone who wasn't already read in, not to Terry, not to the handful of people I'd let close enough over the years to ask. The only thing I let myself keep was the call sign, because Ghost after that night stopped being about radio discipline. A ghost isn't someone who disappears. I didn't know that yet. I'd figure it out slowly over years, the way you figure out most things that matter. But that night in Kessler's living room with Ray Doucette's words still settling in the room like dust after a door opens, I felt something close in me quietly. Not close like a wound closing, close like a door you've been holding open for a draft finally gently being allowed to shut. I finally stopped holding it open. Admiral Kessler asked if I wanted to sit down. I said no. I was fine standing. Which was true, in the way that things are true, when your body is running on something older and steadier than comfort, the same thing that kept me upright in debriefs in cockpits, in rooms where the easiest thing would have been to fold, and I chose not to. The room had rearranged itself around me in the way rooms do after something shifts the center of gravity. People had moved quietly, instinctively into a loose semicircle, not crowding, not performing, just present in the way people are when they understand they're standing at the edge of something real. Carol Kessler, the Admiral's wife, had brought me a glass of water without being asked. I held it with both hands the way I'd held the sweet tea earlier, which feels like a different evening now, a different version of this room. Ray Doucette was still settled in his wheelchair to my left, bourbon resting on his knee, watching Admiral Kessler with the patient attention of a man who knew what was coming and had decided the younger people in the room needed to hear it more than he needed to. In 2021, Kessler said to the room, to me, to the particular quality of quiet that had settled over everything, a portion of the operational record from a 2009 South China Sea mission was submitted for declassification review. He paused. I submitted it. I'd been trying to get it through for 6 years. There were obstacles. He said the word obstacles the way military men say words for things that were actually people doing things they shouldn't have done. Clean word. Dirty referent. The review concluded in the spring of 2022. The findings were significant. He looked at me directly. Among other things, the review established that the original after-action assessment, the one that raised questions about Commander Hayes' judgment and decision-making on that mission, was compromised. The word compromised landed in the room like a stone into still water. The circles went out from it and touched everything. Compromised how? Someone asked quietly from the back. One of the uniformed officers near the hallway. Kessler looked at him. External pressure, he said, applied to a civilian liaison on the review board. The pressure originated from outside the chain of command. It was indirect, deniable by design, but the 2022 review traced it. He stopped there. He looked at me again, and in his eyes was the expression of a man who is about to hand you something you deserved a long time ago and has been holding carefully, making sure it didn't get damaged in transit. The pressure, he said, was traced to a private legal consulting firm out of Houston, Texas. The room did not react immediately. Rooms rarely do when the thing they're hearing is large enough. There's a delay the brain processes, the body catches up, and then something happens in the face and the hands and the chest that wasn't there a moment before. I heard Brett before I saw him move. Not words. A sound. A soft, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes before the filter engages, before the performer in him could shape it into something presentable. The sound of a man who has just watched the floor open. I turned slowly. He was still near the fireplace. He hadn't moved physically. He was in the same position, glass in hand, blazer slightly rumpled from the evening. But everything that had been assembled about him, the ease, the confidence, the comfortable certainty of a man who'd spent 16 years knowing exactly where he stood in the story he'd told about his life, all of it had gone somewhere. What was left was just a man, smaller than the performance, considerably smaller. His eyes found mine. I want to tell you I felt something dramatic in that moment. Triumph, rage, the white-hot specific satisfaction of 16 years of you peaked in high school, burning down to ash in real time in front of witnesses. I felt none of those things. What I felt was something quieter and considerably stranger. I felt like I was watching someone I used to know find out that the story he'd been living in was fiction. And the fiction hadn't just been about me. It had been about him, about the kind of man he was, the kind of choices he'd made, the kind of person he'd needed me to be in order for his version of events to make sense. He had told himself he left because I peaked in high school, because I wasn't going anywhere, because he was choosing forward motion and I was choosing stagnation. He had not told himself the other part. Or if he had, he'd found a way to file it somewhere that didn't require him to look at it directly. "I didn't know," he said. Quiet. To no one in particular, or to everyone, or to me. I wasn't sure he knew the difference. I asked someone to look into it. He stopped. Started again. "I was angry. I just lost you and I was angry, and I asked someone I knew on a military legal consulting board if there was any way to..." He stopped again. "I didn't think it would. I didn't know what he would do with it." The room was very still. You could hear the ceiling fan. You could hear faintly the water outside the tall windows. Someone's glass touched a coaster. That was all. I looked at him for a long moment. Brett Calloway, 46 years old, standing in the light of a fireplace in someone else's house, watching the architecture of 16 years of self-justification come apart in a room full of people he'd wanted to impress. I thought about Bahrain, the granola bar that tasted like cardboard and salt, the 109 degrees. Good, I'd thought when Cindy told me about Lauren. Good, and then back to work. I thought about Marcus Webb and his grandmother's photograph. I thought about every room I had made myself quiet in, every question I had answered without deflecting, every year I had carried what I'd been asked to carry without putting it down in a place where someone else would have to step around it. And standing there in the still of that room with Ray Doucette's bourbon resting on his knee and Carol Kessler's water glass in my hands and Terry somewhere just behind my left shoulder where she'd been my entire life, I realized something. I wasn't angry. I had expected to be angry if this day ever came. I had imagined this day in various forms over the years, not often, not deliberately, just the way certain things surface in the hours before dawn when your defenses are down, and in every version of it there was anger. Clean, righteous, overdue. There wasn't. There was just the truth finally standing in a room where it could be seen by everyone who needed to see it. And Brett looking at me like a man watching the floor open under his feet, not yet knowing how deep it goes. He looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. I suppose in a way he had. Brett started talking. That was the thing I hadn't prepared for. In the versions of this I'd imagined, and I want to be honest, I had imagined versions the pre-dawn kind, the ones you don't ask for and can't quite stop in those versions. He went quiet. The truth landed and he went quiet. And that was the end of it. Clean. Resolved. A door closing softly on something that had been left open too long. Brett did not go quiet. He talked the way people talk when they are afraid not of you, but of the story about themselves that is currently being revised in real time in front of witnesses. Fast and explanatory, the words tripping over each other in a way that was completely unlike the easy practice social fluency I'd watched him deploy all evening. The lawyer's voice was gone. What was left was something raw and considerably less polished. "I need to explain," he said. Because what it sounds like and what actually happened there's context. There's context that matters here. Nobody invited him to continue. Nobody stopped him either. I made a call, he said, to a colleague, someone who worked adjacent to military legal review. I was venting honestly, I was going through something, and I asked if there was anything, if there was a process. I didn't tell him to do anything specific. I didn't know he had the reach to actually... Mr. Calloway. Admiral Kessler's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of a thing that has been at rest for a long time and does not need to exert itself to be heard. I don't think you're being asked to explain yourself. Brett stopped. I'm simply presenting what the review found, Kessler said. What you do with that information is your own business. He looked at Brett for precisely as long as was necessary, and then looked away, which was its own complete sentence. Brett turned to me. The room felt it. The turn the attention redirected the specific quality of a man who needs the person he wronged to be the one to let him off the hook, because everyone else in the room has already decided not to. Danny, he said. I genuinely did not know what he would do. You have to believe that. I looked at him. I thought about what I wanted to say. I had in the space of the last 10 minutes cycled through approximately 15 versions of it, some generous, some not, some measured, some that would have felt very good for about 4 seconds, and then considerably less good for considerably longer. I had a full arsenal of things I could have said to Brett Calloway in that moment in that room, with those witnesses that would have been true and earned and completely justified. I said, I believe you didn't think about what he would do, Brett. That's actually worse. Not loud, not performing. Just the truth at the temperature it actually was set down in the space between us, like something that didn't need anything further from me. His mouth opened, closed. The girlfriend, the woman in the careful dress who'd been mapping the room all evening, looked at her shoes. Not in shame, in recognition. The expression of a woman who has heard a version of this particular quality of carelessness before, possibly recently, and is doing a private accounting in her own chest that has nothing to do with me. Brett opened his mouth again. He was going to try a third version of the explanation. I could see it assembling behind his eyes, a new angle, a different framing, the lawyer's instinct to find the argument that lands. Ray Doucette spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift in his wheelchair. He just set his bourbon down on the side table with a small definitive click and said in the graveling creek water voice that had once been heard over the sound of rotors and wind and things considerably louder than a living room in Norfolk, Virginia sun. Brett looked at him. I have watched men die, Ray said, who spent their last seconds making sure the people around them were going to be all right. I have watched men walk into things they knew they weren't walking back out of, and not one of them spent that time explaining themselves. He paused. Not for effect, because what he was saying was true, and true things don't need to be rushed. You've had your say. You've had more than your say. What you do now is what you actually are. The room held its breath. Then Ray Doucette turned away. He picked up his bourbon. He turned back toward Admiral Kessler, and he said something quietly. Something about San Antonio, about a bar they'd both been to in 1987. Something low and private that had nothing to do with Brett Calloway or me or any of this, and just like that he was in a different conversation in a different part of the evening, and Brett was standing at the edge of it with no entry point and no invitation. I had seen men dismissed before, in military contexts, in professional ones, in the particular institutional language of people who have the authority to indicate that you are no longer relevant to the proceedings. But I had never seen it done with such complete economy. No anger, no theater. just a door quietly in someone's face. Terry stepped out from behind my left shoulder. She didn't say anything to Brett. She didn't look at him. She stepped out and she stood beside me shoulder to shoulder, and she slipped her hand into mine the way she'd done when we were children, my little sister standing in the gap doing what she'd always done, which was show up. Dave materialized on my other side. He didn't say anything either. He just handed me a fresh glass of sweet tea, like a man who had identified the one useful thing he could do in this situation and done it immediately, which is the best and most Dave thing Dave has ever done. I took it with my free hand. Brett stood there for another moment in the way of a man who needs a graceful exit and cannot locate one, and then he said to the air, to me, to no one in particular, I'm going to get some air. He walked toward the back door. The room didn't watch him go. That was the thing. Nobody turned to track him. Nobody marked the exit. The conversations that had paused resumed quietly in the way water fills a space when something is removed from it. He walked out and the room closed behind him like he'd never been the center of it, which I realized he never had been. Not really. Not tonight. His girlfriend sat in her chair for a long moment, both hands around her glass, looking at the middle distance in the way of someone processing new information about a decision they thought they'd already made. She didn't follow him. She didn't look surprised. She looked like a woman doing math she should have done earlier, arriving at an answer she had probably already suspected, and deciding quietly and without announcement what she was going to do about it. I understood that feeling completely. It started with Lieutenant Commander Patricia Osei. I didn't know she was in the room. I hadn't seen her, which tells you something about how the evening had reorganized my attention, because Patty Osei is not someone you typically miss in a room. She's 6 feet tall, carries herself like a woman who has been underestimated so many times that she's stopped registering it as an event, and she has a voice that was built for flight decks and does not scale down easily to living rooms. She was standing near the hallway in a dark green dress, and she cleared her throat once the way you do when you've decided to speak and are giving the room a single beat to be ready. "I flew the recovery mission," she said. The room looked at her. After the Biendong incident, I was part of the 4 aircraft element that went back out the next morning. We were looking for... She stopped. Adjusted. We were looking for Lieutenant Webb. She said his name carefully, the way you say the names of people who deserve to have their names said carefully. We were also looking for the aircraft, and for anything that could be used to establish what had actually happened out there. She looked at me, not seeking permission, just acknowledging. What we found was consistent with everything Commander Hayes reported: the ground fire positions, the egress angle, the debris pattern. A pause. I filed a supplementary statement with the review board in 2009. I was told it was received. I was never told what happened to it after that. The 2 uniformed officers near the hallway exchanged the look they'd been exchanging all evening, the shorthand of people who have been in enough institutional situations to know exactly what I was told it was received means when it's followed by a silence that lasts 14 years. "Thank you, Patty," Admiral Kessler said, quietly. She nodded, sat back down. Then Chief Warrant Officer Dennis Farrow stood up. I knew Dennis. Barely he'd been ground coordination on the mission one of the 6. We'd spoken twice in the 14 years since, both times briefly, both times with the specific careful distance of 2 people who share knowledge of something that has never been officially resolved. He was stockier now, grayer at the beard, in a civilian suit that fit him like a man who wore suits maybe twice a year and was fine with that. He didn't make a speech. Dennis Farrow was not a speech-making man. He said, "She made the right call. I was on the ground. I know what the right call looked like from down there." He sat back down. 4 words. She made the right call. I had not heard those words in that sequence in 14 years, said out loud in a room by someone who was there. My throat did the thing again. I looked at a point above Dennis Farrow's left shoulder and waited. Then a third person stood. I didn't know him, a man in his late 60s, civilian clothes, white hair, the bearing of someone who had served and was now several years out from it. He introduced himself as Captain James Whitfield, retired formerly of Naval Air Forces Pacific. He had not been on the mission, but he had been on the 2009 review board, the original one. The room went very still in a different way. "I was a junior member," he said. "I raised questions about the external pressure we were receiving regarding the Hayes assessment. I was told those questions were outside my scope." He stopped, looked at his hands briefly. "I should have pushed harder. I didn't. I told myself I'd done what I could." He looked up. "I've thought about that for a long time." He looked at me directly. "I'm sorry, Commander. That's 14 years late, and I understand if it doesn't amount to much. But I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. This man I didn't know, who had been in a room I never saw, who had asked a question that went unanswered, who had been carrying a version of this weight in his own way for the same 14 years I'd been carrying mine, just from a different angle. "It amounts to something," I said. He nodded, sat down. The room breathed. People over 60 understand this moment. I think it's harder to explain to younger people, but you know it when you've lived enough years to have had your own version of it. The moment when things that were true for a long time but could not be spoken, get spoken. Not to fix anything. Some things don't get fixed. They just get true. But because the truth has its own weight and its own need, and when it's finally allowed to stand upright in a room, something shifts in everyone present. Even the people it doesn't directly belong to. Terry was crying. She wasn't making a production of it. She had her chin up and her face composed in the way that means the tears are happening, but she has decided they are her business and not the room's. Dave had his arm around her and was not saying anything, which was exactly right. Carol Kessler came and stood beside me again. She didn't touch my arm. She just stood close in the way of a woman who had spent 31 years learning the difference between comfort that helps and comfort that inserts itself, and had long ago mastered the former. Ray Doucette had his bourbon and his quiet and was watching the room with the expression of a man who had wanted this to happen and was satisfied without being surprised that it had. He caught my eye once briefly. He nodded. One small, complete nod. I thought about Marcus Webb. I thought about him the way I always think about him, not the last radio transmission, not the static, but the earlier version. The laugh, the cornbread rankings, the photograph tucked inside the flight suit zipper. I thought about whether he would have wanted to be in this room, and I decided yes, not for the ceremony of it. Marcus never cared much for ceremony, but because people who loved him were saying his name and meaning it, and that would have mattered to him. It mattered to me. The back door opened. Brett came back inside. He'd been out there long enough that the cold had gotten into his blazer, his shoulders were tight with it, his jaw set. He looked around the room with the expression of a man who had gone outside hoping the room would have rearranged itself in his absence, and found upon returning that it had done the opposite. His girlfriend was still in her chair. She looked at him when he came in. Held his gaze for a long moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, which is a very long time to hold someone's gaze when both of you know what's in it. Then she looked away. Not at me. Not at anyone in particular. Just away. The specific direction of a woman who has made a decision and is in the quiet first seconds of it. Brett stood in the doorway. He didn't look surprised. He just looked tired in the way people look tired when the performance has finally cost more than they have available to spend on it. I understood that feeling too. I just understood it from the other side. The party ended the way good parties end, not all at once, but in layers. The older guests first, the ones with early mornings, and the particular wisdom of people who know when a thing has reached its natural conclusion and don't need to be the last ones holding a glass to prove they were present. Then the uniformed officers' handshakes and quiet words, the kind of goodbyes that carry whole paragraphs in a single grip. Then Patty Osei, who hugged me once hard, brief the hug of a woman who doesn't hug often and means it completely when she does, and said long overdue into my shoulder before she walked out into the Virginia night. Dennis Farrow shook my hand at the door. He said he would have hated all the fuss. He meant Marcus. He was right. We both smiled at that, the specific smile of people sharing knowledge of someone who is no longer there to confirm it. Captain Whitfield stopped on his way out and said nothing, just put his hand briefly on my arm and kept walking. That was enough. That was more than enough. Brett left before the layers started. He and his girlfriend walked out together, but not together, 2 feet of distance between them that had not been there when they arrived, a geography that said everything and required no translation. I watched them go from across the room. He didn't look back. She did. Just once. Not at me at the room at the evening at whatever she was cataloging about it, then she was gone. The days after that had a quality I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not resolution exactly. Something quieter than both. Like the specific silence that comes after a long-running sound finally stops when you realize by its absence how much of your attention it had been consuming without your knowing. I drove back to Virginia Beach the next morning. I stopped at the same bakery on Granby Street because I'd run out of pecan cookies the night before, and that felt like a reasonable excuse to go back. I sat in the parking lot with a coffee and ate a cookie and watched the Saturday morning traffic on the street and thought this is a good enough morning. Which is not a small thing. It is actually a very complete thing dressed in ordinary clothes. Terry called that afternoon. She cried on the phone for about 4 minutes before she could properly speak, which is the most Terry thing that has ever happened in the history of Terry. When she found her words, they were, "I didn't know. Danny, I didn't know any of it. I didn't know what you'd been carrying. Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that for a moment. About all the reasons classified and otherwise. About the habit of carrying things quietly that had started as necessity and become character. About the years of I'm fine and it's just work and the small shake of my head across crowded rooms. "I didn't know how to tell it as a story yet," I said. It was still just something that happened. She was quiet for a moment. "Is it a story now?" "Getting there." She cried a little more. I let her. It was her right. She'd been standing at the edge of something she couldn't see for a long time, and now she could see it, and the appropriate response to that is exactly what she was doing. "I'm sorry I dragged you to that party," she said when she'd leveled out. "Don't be." I had no idea. "Terry," I said it gently. "It was the right room. It turned out to be the right room." She laughed, wet and unsteady. "I brought you into the same room as Brett Calloway and Admiral Kessler and a retired Navy SEAL, and somehow it worked out." "Somehow," I said. 3 weeks later, an email arrived from a Houston address I didn't recognize at first. Then I did. Brett. I sat with the unopened email for 2 days. Not avoiding it, more like letting it be what it was before I decided what to do with it. On the 3rd day I opened it. It was long. 3 paragraphs, which for Brett was an exercise in concision because Brett Calloway had never in his life used one word where 11 would do. The first paragraph was explanation. The second was clarification of the explanation. The third was the closest thing to an apology that a man can write when he is still in some chamber of his chest, uncertain whether he did something wrong or whether something wrong simply happened in his vicinity. He said, "I have been thinking about what Ray Doucette said to me, about what a person actually is. I don't have a good answer for that right now. He said, I don't expect anything from you. I just needed to say it somewhere." He did not say, "I'm sorry your career was damaged." He did not say, "I'm sorry about Marcus Webb." He did not say, "I'm sorry I told you that you peaked in high school when you were 27 years old and building a life I was too small to see properly." Those were the versions of the email I had wanted on some level in some pre-dawn room of the last 16 years. They weren't in there. I read the email once. I closed it. I did not reply. Not from anger, I want to be clear about that. Not from satisfaction either. Some doors just don't require a response on your way through them. You walk through and you keep walking, and the door does what doors do behind you. Admiral Kessler called the following week. Not about Brett. About the paperwork. It was formal, brief. He had that quality on the phone, the same compression he had in person, the ability to say large things in small packages. He told me that the official rehabilitation of the after-action record had been processed, that the record now reflected the actual findings of the 2022 review, that my service history had been corrected accordingly. He said, "I'd like to do this properly if you'll let me. There's a ceremony we could arrange, something formal with proper—" "I don't need a ceremony," I said. A pause. "I know you don't need it. I'm asking if you want it." I thought about that, about what wanting something looked like after years of not allowing the question. "A small one," I said finally. "Just people who were there. No strangers." "Done," he said. "I'll set it up." It happened on a Thursday morning in late October in his office at the naval station. October light coming through the tall windows, the particular gold of it that doesn't last long in Virginia before the cold takes over. 6 people present: Kessler, his aide, Patty Ossie, Dennis, Pharaoh Terry, and me. Ray Doucette had sent a handwritten note that his knees weren't up to the drive. The note was 3 sentences long, and the last one said, "You always knew who you were, Commander." The Navy just finally caught up. Kessler handed me the paperwork across his desk, stood, offered his hand. "You never needed this to know who you are," he said, "but you deserve to have it anyway." Outside, the gold light moved across the water. The world kept moving the way it does. The way it always does, indifferent to the weight of what people carry through it and quietly, decently beautiful anyway. I drove home with the paperwork in the passenger seat and the radio on Old Country, the station out of Chesapeake that still plays Merle Haggard and means it. And I thought about Marcus and about cornbread and about how the best things in a life are sometimes not the loud ones. Sometimes they are a Thursday morning with gold on the water and a drive home on a highway you know by heart. That was enough. More than enough. A year later, I live in a house in North Carolina that is smaller than any place I have lived since flight school. That's not a complaint. It's a fact I have come to appreciate the way you appreciate things that turn out to be exactly the right size, not too much, not too little. Just the dimensions of an actual life lived by one actual person who has stopped trying to take up less space than she occupies. 3 bedrooms, a porch that faces east, a yard with 2 live oaks that were old before I was born and will be standing long after I'm done. The kitchen smells like coffee in the mornings. The floors creak in a specific way that I know by heart now which board, which step, which spot near the back door. I know the sounds of this house the way I once knew the sounds of every aircraft I flew. Completely. Without thinking. The dog's name is Marcus. He is a 3-year-old hound mix, brown and white ears, too large for his head, an absolutely unreasonable amount of personality for an animal of his size. He found me technically, or the shelter found me, which found him, which amounts to the same thing. He sleeps at the foot of the bed and takes his role as early warning system for squirrels very seriously, and has never once in 10 months of cohabitation failed to make me feel upon walking in the door like my arrival was the event the entire day had been building toward. I named him on the drive home from the shelter. I didn't deliberate about it. It was just true. Terry comes down the first weekend of every month. She brings the kids 9 and 11 now loud in the specific way of children who feel safe, and we eat on the porch, and the kids chase Marcus around the yard, and she and I sit with our coffee and talk about the kinds of things sisters talk about when they've stopped keeping things from each other, which is everything and nothing and all the in-between ordinary stuff that turns out to be what a life is mostly made of. She cried again the first time she saw the house. Not from sadness. From relief, I think the relief of seeing someone she loves finally in a place that fits them. I let her cry. I made her coffee. Marcus put his head in her lap and she laughed through the crying, and that was that. Ray Doucette writes letters. Actual letters on actual paper in the slightly architectural handwriting of a man who learned penmanship in an era when it was considered a basic life skill. They arrive from Pensacola, Florida, roughly once every 6 weeks, and they contain observations about the weather, opinions about the state of the Navy, which grow more pointed with each successive letter, memories that surface and get written down before they can fade, and occasional questions about Marcus the dog, whose updates he seems to genuinely look forward to. I write back. Also on paper. It takes me longer than it should because I am out of practice with handwriting, and also because I find more often than not that I have more to say than I expected. That surprises me still, that there is more to say. Admiral Kessler retired to San Antonio as promised. He sends Christmas cards. His wife Carol includes a separate note inside each one with actual news, which is the superior system, and I have told her so. Patty Osei made captain last spring. I sent flowers. She called to tell me flowers were unnecessary and also that she appreciated them. That's Patty exactly. I wouldn't change a word of it. Dennis Farrow coaches youth baseball in a small town outside Raleigh. I know this because he texted me a photograph of his team holding a regional trophy, and the caption said only still making the right call. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I don't know what happened with Brett and his girlfriend. I don't know, and I have not looked. That's not coldness. It's the recognition that some chapters end when they end, and the story doesn't require you to keep reading past the last page. He was wrong about me. Not just the way he was wrong that the review uncovered deeper than that. He was wrong about what I was doing, what the Navy meant, and what I meant inside of it. He looked at my life and saw someone running from something. What I was actually doing was moving towards something in the only direction I knew how to move forward, steady at the speed the mission required. That's not his fault entirely. Some people look at a life that doesn't resemble theirs and can only read it as a failure. It's a failure of imagination more than anything else. I spent 16 years carrying it as if it were a failure of mine. I don't anymore. Now. The Callsign. I've been asked about it since that night by Terry, by a few people who've heard pieces of the story by Ray in one of his letters where he phrased the question with the directness of a man who spent 30 years getting to the point and has no intention of stopping now. What does ghost mean to you now? Commander. I thought about it for 3 weeks before I wrote back. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I wanted the right one. The true one. Here is what I wrote. A ghost in the old sense isn't about disappearing. It's about the opposite. It's about persisting past the point where you were supposed to stop. Staying in the room when the room has decided you aren't there. Being present in a way that can't be officially acknowledged but can't quite be gotten rid of either. When they gave me that call sign, they meant I flew like I wasn't really there. Quiet. Low signature. Hard to locate on a scope. After Biendong, it meant something else. I came back from something that wasn't on any official record. I existed in a space the paperwork didn't account for. I was real in ways the institutions around me had decided for their own convenience to treat as theoretical. A ghost isn't proof of something supernatural. A ghost is proof that something real happened. Marcus happened, the mission happened, the 14 years happened. They were real. They were weight-bearing. They shaped everything that came after them quietly, the way foundations do, invisible, essential, holding up the whole structure. The call sign was never about being invisible. It was about being undeniable. I know that now. Marcus the dog is asleep on the porch as I write this, legs twitching in whatever dream dogs have when the afternoon sun is on their backs, and the yard is full of squirrel-adjacent opportunity. The live oaks are doing what live oaks do, standing, growing, being older and less hurried than everything around them. The coffee has gone cold because I let it. I finally sleep without the radio on. That took a long time. Longer than I expected and shorter than I feared. Some nights the old sounds come back, rotors static, a voice going level in the dark, and I let them come, and I let them pass, and I breathe, and the house makes its familiar sounds around me, and Marcus shifts at the foot of the bed, and the night continues in the direction nights go. Forward. Always forward. If you've listened to this whole story, if you sat with me through all of it, then you know something about the cost of staying quiet when speaking felt impossible. And maybe you know something about waiting, about what it means to carry a thing for so long that you've stopped noticing the weight of it until the day someone finally helps you set it down. I want to ask you something before I go. Is there something you've been carrying that deserves to be set down? A version of yourself that someone told you was the ceiling when it was actually just the floor? If there is, I hope you find your room. I hope the right people are in it when you do. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what this brought up for you. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this one, someone who's been told they peaked, who's been made small in a room that didn't deserve them, send it to them. That's the only reason to tell a story, to find the person who needed it. Thank you for being here.